My siblings mocked me for my choices, but when Dad's will was read, they were left with nothing. The soil tells a different story each season. That's something the people who left will never understand. My name is Rachel Turner, and I'm what they call the one who stayed behind. Not that anyone around here calls me that, they just know me as Stan Turner's daughter, the girl who runs the family farm alongside her father. It's the whispers from Chicago and New York that carry that particular title, whispered from the lips of my brother and sister when they think I can't hear. It's funny how choices define us. At least that's what my siblings believe. Jonathan chose law school, then a corner office in a Chicago high-rise with a view of Lake Michigan. Melissa chose fashion design, then a sleek apartment in Manhattan where she hosts cocktail parties for people whose names occasionally appear in magazines. And I chose dirt, tractors, and the family legacy that stretches across 200 acres of Nebraska farmland. You could have been something, Rachel, Jonathan told me at Christmas 5 years ago, loosening his designer tie after too much eggnog. You had the highest SAT scores of all of us. I remember smiling as I refilled his glass. I am something, John. I'm a farmer. He laughed like I'd told a joke, but his eyes held pity. My decision wasn't made in a single moment. There was no dramatic family meeting where I pounded my fist on the kitchen table and declared my intention to till the soil for the rest of my days. Instead, it happened in quiet increments, staying home after high school to help during a difficult harvest season, postponing college applications, taking agriculture courses at the community college, and slowly realizing that the temporary had become permanent. Meanwhile, Melissa and Jonathan sprinted away from our small town of Riverdale as if it were on fire. Their occasional visits home became performances, stories of important cases won or celebrity clients dressed, always performed with an air of generosity, as if they were granting us glimpses into a superior world. You know what Diane von Furstenberg told me last week? Melissa would begin, not waiting for an answer before launching into another tale of her glamorous existence. Dad would nod appreciatively, his weathered hands clasped on the kitchen table, a quiet pride in his eyes. I sometimes wondered if he wished I had similar stories to tell. You gave up your life for dirt and animals, Melissa sneered once, after I explained I couldn't attend her New York gallery opening because it coincided with calving season. Don't you want more than this? Her gesture encompassed our farmhouse, the fields visible through the windows, my entire existence. The truth is, I did want more, but not what she was offering. I wanted to keep alive the land that had sustained our family for 4 generations. I wanted to preserve the knowledge that my great-grandfather had passed down, knowledge that couldn't be found in textbooks. I wanted sunrise over cornfields and the satisfaction of harvest, the weight of legacy and the freedom of open spaces. Holidays became a special kind of torture. I'd spend days preparing, cleaning the farmhouse until it gleamed, cooking traditional meals from Mom's recipes, trying to recreate the warmth of childhood. They'd arrive with expensive gifts and minimal time, checking emails between courses, discussing their return flights before they'd fully unpacked. Rachel's our rock, Dad would say, squeezing my shoulder. Don't know what I'd do without her. Jonathan and Melissa would exchange looks I wasn't meant to see, knowing glances that communicated their shared theory. I stayed for the inheritance. In their minds, I was playing the long game, sacrificing my youth to eventually claim the farm when Dad passed. The assumption stung, but I never corrected them. What would be the point? They'd never understand that I stayed for love, not land. There were lonely nights, of course. Times when I scrolled through social media, seeing classmates with families of their own, careers in distant cities, vacations in exotic places. I'd wonder what might have been if I'd chosen differently. But then morning would come, and with it, the sunrise over fields that knew my footsteps as intimately as I knew their contours. Dad and I developed a rhythm over the years. We'd work side by side, speaking in the shorthand of people who understand each other's thoughts. He taught me everything: how to read the sky for coming weather, how to gauge when a field is ready for harvest, how to repair machinery with limited parts, how to make decisions that would affect not just this season, but seasons yet to come. Farming isn't just about growing crops, he'd say. It's about growing time. You plant today what others will harvest tomorrow. I didn't know then how prophetic those words would be. I only knew that while my siblings chased success across the country, I found it right here, in the soil my ancestors had tended. They left. I stayed. And in that choice, that simple, complex choice, I found purpose. What I couldn't have known was how drastically that purpose would shift in the coming months, or how the quiet devotion I'd shown would yield a harvest none of us could have predicted. I couldn't have known that Dad was making plans of his own, plans that would upend everything we'd built together and challenge the very foundations of our family. But that's the thing about farming. You plant seeds without ever truly knowing what will grow. It started with small things, a forgotten conversation, misplaced keys, the tractor left running overnight. At first, I dismissed these moments as simple fatigue. Dad was pushing 70, after all, and farming extracts a price from even the strongest bodies. Just tired, Ratch, he'd say whenever I expressed concern, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Been working these fields for 50 years. Bound to get a little foggy sometimes. But by mid-spring, I couldn't ignore the signs. Dad struggled to recall the names of neighbors he'd known for decades. He'd stand in the middle of the barn, confusion clouding his features, as if he'd forgotten what he came for. His hands, once steady enough to repair the most delicate farm equipment, now trembled when he held his coffee mug. The day I found him wandering in the north pasture in his pajamas, disoriented and chilled by the morning dew, I knew we needed help. "I'm not going to any doctor," he insisted when I brought him home, wrapping him in blankets. "They'll just tell me I'm old. Don't need to pay someone to hear what I already know." But I persisted, and a week later, we sat in Dr. Mendez's office as she explained the early signs of dementia, possibly Alzheimer's. Dad stared out the window during the entire consultation, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line I'd seen all my life when he refused to acknowledge a problem he couldn't fix with his hands. "We'll manage," I told him on the drive home, reaching across the truck's bench seat to squeeze his hand. Together like always. His eyes, when they met mine, held a vulnerability I'd never seen before. "You shouldn't have to deal with this, Rachel. You're too young to be saddled with an old man's problems." "I'm exactly where I want to be," I replied, and I meant it, even as fear knotted in my stomach. The next few months became a balancing act, managing Dad's medication, keeping the farm running, and becoming increasingly vigilant as his condition deteriorated. I learned to sleep lightly, alert to any sound that might indicate Dad was wandering. I installed child-proof locks on doors and cabinets, removed the keys from all vehicles, and put bells on the exterior doors. I called Jonathan and Melissa to share the diagnosis. Both expressed appropriate concern, promised to visit soon, and sent expensive care packages instead. A cashmere sweater from Melissa, for when it gets chilly, Daddy, and a state-of-the-art tablet from Jonathan, to help keep his mind active, according to studies. Dad refused to wear the sweater. Too fancy for feeding chickens, and the tablet remained untouched in its box. What he needed wasn't things, it was presence. But I couldn't make my siblings understand that through brief phone calls and abbreviated text messages. By summer, I'd become Dad's nurse, cook, driver, farmhand, and memory keeper. I tracked his medication, prepared meals he could easily digest, drove him to appointments, handled the farm work, and gently reminded him of who people were when names escaped him. "That's Tim Reynolds' dad. He buys our hay for his horses. That's Maria from church. She brings us that peach cobbler you like. That's Dr. Mendez. We see her every month now." Some days were better than others. On good days, Dad would sit on the porch, telling stories from his youth with surprising clarity, or walk with me through the fields, offering farming advice that had been ingrained in him since childhood. On bad days, he'd accuse me of stealing from him, or worse, not recognize me at all. "Who are you?" he asked one evening as I brought him his dinner. "Where's my Rachel?" I learned to swallow my hurt, to answer calmly, "I am Rachel, Dad. I am right here," and to wait patiently for recognition to flicker in his eyes. It was during this period that I began noticing strange behaviors beyond his illness. Dad started hiding papers in odd places, tucked inside his boots, folded into the pages of farming almanacs, stuffed between mattresses. When I'd find them and try to organize them, he'd become agitated. "Those are private," he'd insist, snatching them away with surprising strength. "Business matters." Late at night, when he thought I was asleep, I'd hear him on the phone, his voice taking on a lucidity that had become rare during daylight hours. "Yes, everything's in order," I overheard him saying one night. "She doesn't suspect anything. No, the others don't know either. It's all set up through the trust." "Yes, Mr. Harris, I understand the implications." The next morning, when I asked who he'd been talking to, his expression turned blank. "Phone? Didn't use any phone." My concern deepened when I found bank statements showing large transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. When I gently questioned him, Dad became uncharacteristically sharp. "Not everything is your business, Rachel, even if you think this farm is." The word stung, but I reminded myself it was the disease talking, not my father. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath his confusion, Dad was orchestrating something significant, something he was deliberately keeping from me. One evening, after a particularly difficult day where Dad had refused to eat and accused me of trying to poison him, I found him sitting lucid and calm in his study, carefully examining a thick folder of documents. "Dad," I said softly, "what are you doing up so late?" He looked up, and for a moment, I saw the father I remembered, sharp, present, purposeful. "Just making sure everything's in order, Ratch. For when the time comes." "What time? What's in order?" He closed the folder deliberately. "You'll understand when the time comes. Some things need to stay secret a little longer." "You're scaring me," I admitted. "Please tell me what's going on." Dad stood slowly, his frame thinner than I remembered, and placed a hand on my cheek. "Don't be scared, Rachel. You stayed when they left. Everything I've done is because of that choice, your choice. Remember that when things change." Before I could press further, his eyes clouded over, and he asked me if I'd seen his reading glasses, the ones perched on top of his head. The moment of clarity was gone, leaving me with more questions than answers. What I didn't know then was that the time Dad spoke of was approaching faster than either of us expected, and the secrets he'd been keeping were about to reshape all our lives in ways none of us could imagine. Dad left this world the same way he lived in it, quietly, without fanfare, on his own terms. I found him on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, peaceful in his bed, looking younger somehow, the worry lines that had etched deeper into his face during his illness smoothed away. The doctor said he likely passed in his sleep, his heart simply deciding it had beaten enough times. My own heart cracked open that morning, pain spilling out in ways I hadn't thought possible. But grief is a luxury that farming doesn't permit for long. The animals still needed feeding, the late harvest still required attention, and now funeral arrangements demanded to be made. So I did what Dad had taught me. I kept moving forward, one foot in front of the other, handling what needed to be handled. Calling Jonathan and Melissa was the hardest part. Their responses were predictably different. Jonathan immediately went into logistics mode. "I'll book a flight for tomorrow. Have you contacted Harris about the will? We should probably meet with him before the funeral. And we'll need to discuss what to do with the farm. I know a realtor who specializes in agricultural properties." Melissa sobbed dramatically into the phone. "Oh my God, I can't believe it. Poor Daddy. I was just about to come visit next month. I had so much to tell him about my new collection." Neither asked how I was doing. The days that followed passed in a blur. I arranged a simple service at the Lutheran church where Dad had attended his entire life. I selected a dark wood casket that reminded me of his favorite rocking chair. I chose photographs for the memorial program. Dad as a young man standing proudly before his first wheat harvest. Dad holding newborn Jonathan. Dad dancing with Mom at their 25th anniversary. Dad with his arm around me at last year's county fair where our corn had won first prize. The morning of the funeral, I stood alone in the farmhouse kitchen, struggling with a black dress I hadn't worn in years, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Through the window, I watched as a sleek rental car pulled up, and my siblings emerged like visitors from another planet. Jonathan wore an impeccably tailored black suit that probably cost more than our last tractor repair. His hair was expertly styled, his shoes gleaming despite the dusty driveway. He surveyed the farmhouse with the assessing eye of a real estate investor, his phone already in hand, checking messages. Melissa stepped out in designer morning wear, black dress, oversized sunglasses, a silk scarf that fluttered dramatically in the autumn breeze. She carried a leather handbag that I recognized from one of her Instagram posts as being straight from Milan. They looked like strangers. "Rachel," Melissa called out, rushing toward me with arms extended for an embrace that felt more performative than comforting. "You poor thing. How have you been managing all alone?" She held me at arm's length, examining my appearance with barely concealed disapproval. "We need to get you some under-eye concealer, stat. You look exhausted." Jonathan gave me a brief, formal hug. "You've handled everything admirably," he said, nodding approvingly. "Dad would be pleased with your efficiency." Efficiency? As if I'd completed a business transaction rather than prepared to bury our father. "The house looks exactly the same," Melissa remarked, glancing around the kitchen. "So quaint and rustic, like stepping back in time." Jonathan was already opening cupboards, peering into the pantry. "We'll need to do a full inventory, of course, for the estate." I stood in the center of the kitchen, watching my siblings claim spaces that had never truly been theirs. They moved through the rooms with the curious detachment of museum visitors, examining Dad's belongings as artifacts rather than pieces of a life they'd chosen to miss. "Oh my God, he still has this hideous chair?" Melissa laughed, pointing to Dad's favorite recliner, the one where he taught me to read, where he'd recovered from his hip surgery 3 years ago, where I'd found him dozing with his reading glasses askew countless evenings. "Probably not worth anything," Jonathan assessed, "but we can include it in the estate sale." The estate sale. They'd been home less than 10 minutes. "There won't be an estate sale," I said quietly. They both turned to look at me, surprised, either by my words or by the fact that I'd spoken at all. "Don't be silly, Rachel," Melissa said, her tone condescending. "You can't possibly want to keep all this stuff." "We haven't even read the will yet," I reminded them. Jonathan's expression shifted subtly. "Right, of course. Mr. Harris is meeting us tomorrow, correct? After the funeral?" I nodded. "Well," he continued, straightening his tie, "I'm sure Dad made provisions that are fair to all of us. After all, while you've been maintaining the property, Melissa and I have been building successful careers that have brought prestige to the Turner name." I bit my tongue to keep from saying what I was thinking, that Dad had never once mentioned being proud of their prestigious careers, but had frequently expressed gratitude for my presence. The funeral itself was well attended. Dad had been respected in the community, and the church overflowed with farmers, local business owners, and families who had known the Turners for generations. Jonathan and Melissa sat beside me in the front pew, Melissa occasionally dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, Jonathan checking his watch every few minutes. During the reception afterward, I watched as they networked their way through the gathering, Melissa charming the mayor with stories of her fashion exploits, Jonathan discussing potential property values with Mr. Johnson from the bank. Neither spent much time with the neighbors who had actually been part of Dad's daily life, the people who had brought casseroles during his illness, who had helped with field work when I couldn't manage alone. That evening, as we picked at the leftover funeral food, Melissa poured herself a generous glass of wine. "So," she said, leaning against the kitchen counter, "what do you think Dad left us? The farm must be worth a small fortune with land prices these days. Hope you didn't sign anything weird, Ratch," she added with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, in all those months taking care of him when his mind was going." The implication hung in the air like a noxious gas. "Melissa," Jonathan warned, though his expression suggested he'd harbored similar thoughts. I felt heat rise to my face, shame, anger, hurt all mingling into a sensation that made it hard to breathe. In their eyes, I was the unpaid farmhand, the failed sibling who might have manipulated a dying man for personal gain. The fact that I'd sacrificed years of my life caring for our father while they built their careers elsewhere didn't seem to factor into their calculations. But I said nothing. I'd lived in silence for so long, swallowing retorts when they belittled my choices, suppressing hurt when they dismissed my life's work, watching quietly as they drifted further from the family they claimed to value. Tomorrow, however, would be different. Tomorrow, Mr. Harris would read the will. And though I didn't know its contents, I sensed that the quiet life I'd built was about to change forever. Mr. Harris arrived at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, his ancient Volvo stirring dust as it rolled up our driveway. He'd been Dad's attorney for over 30 years, a stooped, silver-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually rumpled suit. I'd always liked him for his straightforward manner and the way he spoke to me with the same respect he showed my father. I met him at the door with coffee already prepared the way he liked it, black with 1 sugar. "Thank you, Rachel," he said, accepting the mug with a nod that conveyed more than just gratitude. There was something else in his eyes, something that looked almost like anticipation. Jonathan and Melissa were waiting in the living room, both dressed as if for a business meeting rather than a family gathering. Jonathan sat in Dad's recliner, a territorial choice that made my jaw clench, while Melissa perched on the edge of the sofa, scrolling through her phone. "I found the perfect farmhouse dining table on Pinterest," she announced to no one in particular. "Rustic chic is so on trend right now. This place could be gorgeous with the right renovations." Mr. Harris cleared his throat as he settled at the dining table and opened his weathered leather briefcase. "Shall we begin?" We gathered around him, Jonathan leaning back with practiced nonchalance, Melissa still clutching her phone, me sitting with my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop them from trembling. I wasn't sure what I expected or even what I hoped for. The farm was my home, my life's work alongside Dad. But I'd never presumed it would be mine alone. "Before I read the formal will," Mr. Harris began, "I want to clarify that Stanley Turner was of sound mind when this document was prepared and signed 6 months ago. He made these decisions with full cognitive capacity, confirmed by 2 separate medical evaluations." Jonathan's eyebrows rose slightly. "That seems unusually thorough." "Your father anticipated potential questions," Mr. Harris replied evenly, glancing briefly in my direction. He wanted to ensure his wishes would be respected without challenge. My stomach nodded. Had Dad expected his own children might contest his will? Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses and began to read. "I, Stanley James Turner, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." The legal preamble washed over me in a blur of formal language. I found myself staring at a small water stain on the ceiling, thinking absurdly that I should have fixed it before Mr. Harris arrived, before focusing again on his words. "To my son, Jonathan William Turner, I leave my father's pocket watch and a personal letter to be found in the care of my attorney." Jonathan sat up straighter. "That's it? A watch?" Mr. Harris continued, without acknowledging the interruption. "To my daughter, Melissa and Turner, I leave my late wife's jewelry collection and a personal letter also in my attorney's possession." Melissa's face flushed pink. "What about the farm? The land? There's got to be more." "As for my primary estate," Mr. Harris continued, his voice taking on a new firmness, including the Turner family farm comprising 200 acres of land, all structures thereon, all farm equipment and livestock, all household goods not otherwise specified, and all financial accounts in my name, I leave in their entirety to my daughter, Rachel Marie Turner." The room fell silent. Additionally, Mr. Harris continued into the stunned quiet, "I bequeath to Rachel all shares and interests in Turner Agri-Tech Innovations, the agricultural technology development company I established 10 years ago, of which she has unknowingly been the chief experimental officer through her implementation of crop rotation patterns, seed testing, and sustainable farming methods on our land." My mind reeled. Agri-Tech Innovations? A company? How had I not known? Mr. Harris removed another document from his briefcase. "This company currently holds patents on 7 agricultural innovations developed and tested on Turner land, with annual revenues exceeding $4 million. All profits have been held in trust, separate from the farm's operating accounts, accumulating to a current value of $27 million. The room spun around me. $27 million? Patents? Dad, and I had always tried new farming techniques, experimented with crop rotations, tested soil conservation methods. I'd thought we were just being progressive farmers, not developing patentable technologies. This is absurd, Jonathan sputtered, his composed lawyer demeanor cracking. Dad was a farmer, not some tech entrepreneur. Mr. Harris slid a glossy brochure across the table. There it was, Turner Agri-Tech Innovations, with a familiar logo I'd thought was just our farm's modern rebrand. Inside were photographs of our experimental fields, scientific data from our crop testing, and my name listed as Field Operations Director. Your father, Mr. Harris explained, looking directly at me, was far more than just a farmer. He recognized 20 years ago that agriculture was changing, that technology and sustainable practices would define its future. When his early innovations showed promise, he quietly formed the company, patented his methods, and began licensing them to larger agricultural corporations. He turned to Jonathan and Melissa. He kept it separate from the family finances deliberately. He wanted to see who would value the farm for the farm's sake, not for potential profit. The implications crashed over me like a wave. All those late-night phone calls, the hidden papers, the transfers to unknown accounts. Dad hadn't been confused. He'd been protecting his legacy from those who hadn't valued it enough to stay. This can't be legal, Melissa said, her voice shrill. He was sick. Rachel obviously manipulated him. As I stated, Mr. Harris replied calmly, your father was evaluated by 2 independent medical professionals who confirmed his competence at the time these documents were signed. Furthermore, he added, retrieving more papers, these decisions and the company itself were established long before his illness manifested. Jonathan stood abruptly. We'll contest this. This is clearly not what Dad would have wanted if he'd been thinking clearly. Mr. Harris sighed. Before you pursue that costly and likely futile path, I suggest you read the letters your father left for each of you. They may provide some clarity regarding his decisions. He handed each of my siblings an envelope, then passed a third to me. The paper felt heavy in my hands, Dad's familiar handwriting spelling my name across the front. I'll give you some privacy, Mr. Harris said, rising. Rachel, when you're ready to discuss the transition of the business operations fully into your name, please call my office. As he walked to the door, he paused beside me. Your father was very proud of you, he said softly. He said you had the true heart of a Turner, rooted in the land but always looking toward the horizon. The door closed behind him, leaving the 3 of us in a silence thick with shock, confusion, and the dawning realization that our father had been playing a much longer, more sophisticated game than any of us had imagined. The sound of tearing paper broke the silence as Jonathan ripped open his envelope, his lawyer's composure completely abandoned. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the letter within. Melissa followed suit, her manicured nails struggling with the seal before she finally extracted her letter. I held mine gently, afraid to open it, afraid not to. This is ridiculous, Jonathan muttered, his eyes scanning the first lines of his letter. Then his face changed, color draining from his cheeks. He sank back into Dad's recliner, his expression transforming from anger to something I couldn't quite name. Melissa made a small choking sound as she read, her perfectly applied makeup beginning to streak as tears formed. Curiosity finally overcame my hesitation. I carefully opened my envelope and unfolded the pages inside. Dad's familiar handwriting filled the paper, slightly more tremulous than I remembered, but unmistakably his. My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, I've moved on to be with your mother, and you're learning truths I should have shared long ago. First and foremost, you were never my caretaker or merely my farmhand. You were my partner, my legacy bearer, my proudest achievement. Those crop patterns we tested weren't just experimental farming. They were innovations worth millions. Your instincts about soil conservation, water usage, and sustainable growth were years ahead of the industry. While you thought we were just being good stewards of our land, we were revolutionizing agricultural practices. I formed the company in secret because I wanted to protect what we were building. I'd seen how corporate interests could exploit farmers, so I determined that if our methods were going to change the industry, we would control how. Every penny of profit has been waiting for you, growing just like our crops. I know this revelation will cause turmoil with your siblings. For that, I'm sorry. But they made their choices long ago, just as you made yours. They chose to leave. You chose to stay. They saw dirt. You saw potential. They measured worth in designer labels and downtown addresses. You measured it in sunrise over cornfields and the perfect weight of a ripe tomato in your palm. The page was stained with what looked like tear marks, and I realized mine were now adding to them. Each night, as my mind began to slip away, I would remind myself of what needed to be remembered. Protect Rachel. Secure her future. Honor her sacrifice. You gave up what others consider a normal life to preserve our family's heart and soul. There is no inheritance that could truly repay that gift, but what I've left you comes with no strings, no obligations, no debt. The farm is yours to continue or sell. The company is yours to grow or dissolve. The money is yours to spend or save. My only wish is that you finally put yourself first, something you've never done while I was alive. You have always been seen, Rachel. Always been valued. Always been loved beyond measure. Your father, Stan. P.S. Check the old oak dresser in my room, bottom drawer, under the sweaters. There's something of your mother's I've saved for you alone. I pressed the letter to my chest, tears flowing freely now. Across the room, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Melissa had crumpled into the sofa, her letter clutched in her hand, mascara tracking down her cheeks. Jonathan sat rigidly upright, his letter laid precisely on his lap, his lawyer's mask firmly back in place though his eyes betrayed turmoil. He knew, Melissa whispered, her voice breaking. He knew I offered to put him in Silver Oaks retirement community. He said I wanted to warehouse him to free up the land. She looked up at me, genuine shame in her eyes for perhaps the first time in our adult relationship. I told him it was for his own good, but he saw right through me. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He called me a disappointment dressed in accomplishments, he said, his voice clinically detached. Said I'd traded family legacy for LinkedIn endorsements. That I'd built a career defending corporate interests that would have destroyed farms like ours. He straightened his already perfect tie. He wrote that I have his intelligence but lacked his understanding of what truly matters. The three of us sat in silence, each absorbing the unvarnished truths our father had saved for his final communication. Did you know? Jonathan finally asked, looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something almost like respect. About the company? The patents. I shook my head, still clutching my letter. I had no idea. I just thought we were being innovative farmers. A laugh escaped through my tears. I didn't even know I had a job title. Field Operations Director, Melissa said quietly, a hint of her old sarcasm returning. Only you would become an executive without even trying, Rachel. He left me Mom's jewelry, she continued after a pause, vulnerability creeping into her voice. But he wrote that I never understood its value wasn't in the gems, but in the memories they carried. He said I wore designer labels, but had forgotten how to wear my own name with pride. She wiped at her eyes, smearing her makeup further. God, he didn't pull any punches, did he? He wrote what he never said while alive, Jonathan observed, folding his letter with precise creases. $27 million, he added, disbelief coloring his tone. Our father was a millionaire entrepreneur, and we thought he was just... He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Just a farmer. I finished for him, a strange new confidence in my voice. That was always the problem. You both thought just a farmer was somehow less than what you became. Dad proved otherwise. Melissa examined her designer heels against our worn hardwood floors. So what now? You're the agriculture tech heiress, and we just go back to our lives with a watch and some old jewelry? The question hung in the air, laden with decades of family dynamics, misunderstandings, and choices, both those made consciously and those made through absence. I looked down at my father's last words, feeling simultaneously grief-stricken and oddly liberated. For the first time in my life, I had been truly seen, not just by my father in his final act of recognition, but now by my siblings who could no longer dismiss my choices as failure or sentimentality. "Now," I said, carefully refolding my letter, "I think we need to read each other's letters." Dad wanted us to understand not just his decisions, but each other. It was a suggestion that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. Too intimate, too vulnerable. But in this moment, suspended between what our family had been and what it might yet become, Jonathan and Melissa both nodded in agreement. 6 months after Dad's passing, I walked the western field at sunset, watching golden light wash over rows of experimental drought-resistant corn. The crisp autumn air carries the scent of earth and coming frost, a farmer's signal that another season is ending, making way for the next cycle. Much has changed since that day in the farmhouse when 3 letters shattered and rebuilt our family's understanding of itself. Jonathan and Melissa left 2 days after the will reading, both subdued in ways I'd never witnessed, their usual confidence replaced by something more contemplative. In the following weeks, their lawyers contacted mine. Yes, I have lawyers now, but not to contest the will as I'd feared. Instead, they sought to formalize their surrender of any claim to Dad's estate. "It's what Dad wanted," Jonathan had said in our final conversation before he returned to Chicago. And he was right about me, about all of us. He'd clasped my hand awkwardly, the most genuine connection we'd shared in years. "I don't know how to be a brother anymore, Rachel. I'm not sure I ever learned properly, but I'd like to try if you'll let me." Melissa had been more emotional, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely as we sat on the porch swing the night before her departure. "I've been such a bitch," she'd said bluntly, staring out at the fields. "I was so busy proving I could escape this place that I never saw what you built by staying." She turned to me, her eyes red-rimmed without her usual perfect makeup. "I don't know if we can fix this, but I'd like to visit sometimes. Really visit, not just perform being here." The silence between us had been comfortable for the first time in our adult lives. True to their words, both have maintained sporadic but genuine contact. Jonathan calls every other Sunday, asking detailed questions about the business aspects of Turner Agritech, offering legal advice without trying to take control. Melissa sends care packages now containing homemade items rather than expensive brands, a hand-knitted scarf with a note explaining she's taking classes, cookies she baked herself, photos from her new, smaller apartment in Brooklyn where she's starting her own sustainable fashion line. They're trying. We all are. As for me, the transition from farmer to CEO hasn't been smooth, but I'm finding my way. The chest in Dad's bottom drawer contained Mom's journals, decades of observations about farming, family, and the delicate balance between tradition and innovation. Reading her words has been like finding a piece of myself I never knew was missing, her voice guiding me through this new chapter just as Dad's guidance shaped the last. Turner Agritech now officially employs 37 people, most from our community. Our headquarters occupies what used to be the old Matthews place down the road, a foreclosed farm I purchased and renovated rather than building some glass and steel monstrosity that would look alien against the landscape. I still live in the farmhouse, still work the land alongside my corporate responsibilities. Some things are too important to delegate, too essential to who I am. The research fields expand each season, but I've kept 10 acres for traditional crops, a living museum of the methods my great-grandfather used, a reminder of where we came from. The Stanley Turner Agricultural Scholarship now sends 2 local students to college each year, with the requirement that they return to rural communities afterward, bringing their knowledge back to the places that need it most. It feels like something Dad would have approved of, investing in both progress and preservation. Last week, a journalist from an agricultural trade magazine came to interview me, fascinated by the story of the accidental agri-tech heiress, as some papers have taken to calling me. She walked these same fields with me, recorder in hand, designer boots entirely unsuitable for farmland. "People must say you got lucky," she'd remarked, watching as I checked corn stalks with practiced hands despite my now considerable wealth. Right place, right time, right father. I'd thought about that for a moment before answering. "Luck implies I didn't earn this," I'd finally said. What they'll never understand is how much I gave up to be here. The relationships I didn't form because I was caring for Dad, the places I didn't see because the farm needed tending, the paths I didn't take because I chose this one. The reporter had looked at me with new understanding. So, you sacrificed everything for this inheritance? No, I'd corrected her, watching the sunset paint the buildings of Turner Agritech in the distance. I sacrificed what others valued for what I valued. There's a difference. I didn't stay for an inheritance. I stayed for love of this land, of my father, of a way of life. The inheritance was just Dad's way of making sure the world finally saw what he always saw in me. Now, as dusk settles over the farm that has been in my family for 4 generations, I think about cycles, of seasons, of families, of fortunes. My great-grandfather began with a small plot and a dream. My grandfather expanded through hard work and determination. My father transformed our legacy through innovation and foresight. And me? I'm just beginning to understand my chapter in this continuing story. From the main house, lights flicker on as darkness deepens. Martin, my operations manager, and in a development that would have delighted Dad, my partner of 3 months, will be waiting with dinner. He grew up on the neighboring farm, understands this life in a way my previous dates from town never could. We're taking things slowly, but there's something solid there, something that feels like it could put down roots. I take one last look at the experimental field, next year's potential already sleeping in the soil. Dad was right about farming. It's not just about growing crops. It's about growing time. You plant today what others will harvest tomorrow. I didn't chase the world, I stayed. And in the end, the world came to me. In the quiet symphony of crickets and rustling cornstalks, I whisper words meant for ears no longer present. The harvest is good this year, Dad. Really good. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, I could swear I hear him answer back.